Good evening and welcome to the program. I'm David Speers. It's been the most hotly contested policy issue for the past decade, whether to put a price on carbon. Australians once liked the idea, but not anymore, it seems. Either way, it's now a reality. The Gillard government's carbon tax has come into effect this week. Tonight we're going to look at what it means for you and for the country. We've brought together scientists, commentators and politicians from all three parties. Hopefully we're going to avoid the sloganeering tonight and have a considered discussion about how this carbon tax will work, whether we need it, and indeed what some of the alternatives may be. And we're going to start by getting back to basics and looking at the science. Is man-made global warming really happening? How worried should we be about it? Professor Will Steffen is the head of the Climate Change Institute at the Australian National University and a member of the government's Climate Commission. Professor, how certain are you that climate change is happening?
Well, the basics, scientific basics, are very clear. The evidence for the fact that the planet is warming is unequivocal. We see it not only in the atmosphere, but even more particularly in the oceans, which absorb about 90% of the excess heat at the Earth's surface. The oceans are warming and have been for the last half-century. Ice is melting on Greenland. The Arctic sea ice is melting. If you look at plants and animals around the world and look at a massive evidence, thousands of studies, they are responding in terms of their timing, of flowering, for example, and their movements, all consistent with the fact that the planet is warming.
So we're seeing it happen now.
Absolutely.
You're 100% certain?
Yeah, we use the word unequivocal.
Unequivocal.
I think most people know what unequivocal means.
All right. Well, Professor Garth Paltridge, let me bring you in. The former Chief Research Scientist at the CSIRO, now Emeritus Professor at the University of Tasmania, a visiting fellow at the ANU. You believe the science is still doubtful and agendas are being pushed by people driving a fear campaign, as you've called it. What makes you doubt the science?
David, I've been in the game since the early 70s, I suppose, when the whole of this climate change business started. And in fact, I was involved early on in Geneva with the formation of the World Climate Programme. And in those days, scientists were quite prepared to admit that there's an awful lot of uncertainty associated with the whole research into climate change game. And the thing that worries me most is that uncertainty seems to have been ignored over the last couple of decades.
Is that because there's more evidence now?
No, I don't think so. I think it is because the idea of man-made climate change has gone so far and so fast that the scientists involved feel themselves under enormous pressure to not admit to the uncertainties that are associated with predicting climate change.
Professor Steffen, is Professor Paltridge missing some evidence here? I mean, why is there still uncertainty?
Well, first of all, I don't feel any pressure at all to go along with whatever might be the perceived wisdom. I think you have to go into the quality-controlled scientific literature and see the body of evidence that's been amassed since the 1970s. Indeed, I don't go back quite that far, but I've been in the game since the late 1980s, and there was indeed more uncertainty back then, but science progresses. We do research, we do observations, we improve our models. We test each other, we challenge each other, and we do this not in blogs, not in the media like tonight, we do it in the quality-controlled scientific literature. And when you go to that, you find that there is no debate about the cause of the warming over the past half-century. It's clear. We know the physics, it matches the observations, and so on.
Is that fair enough, Professor Paltridge? The peer-reviewed literature is pretty solid?
I simply can't agree with that. Can I give you a single example of the pressure that is applied to scientists not to admit to uncertainty? And it goes back to the time 15 or 20 years ago when I was associated with trying to set up one of these new, well, it was new then, cooperative research centres in Hobart. And CSIRO was one of the partners of that venture, or was proposed to be one of the partners of the venture. Mm-hmm. And I was interviewed one Easter Saturday for the Australian newspaper, and they had a big article which effectively was making great play of the fact that that myself and a couple of others thought there was a lot of uncertainty around in the science. Now, came out on a Saturday, I think, but suffice it to say, on the Tuesday after Easter, there was a telephone call from the topmost layers of CSIRO, and it said, Garth, if you say that again, we will withdraw from the formation of the Cooperative Research Centre.
So you're saying there's political pressure, funding
undoubtedly
pressure on scientists to say what governments of the day want them to say.
That's right.
Anna Rose, let me bring you in. Anna's the founder and the chair of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and the author of Madlands. There is clearly still some divided opinion on this. What makes you so certain? What's the one strongest piece of evidence you've seen that man-made global warming is real?
Well, I was taught about climate change in school. We learned about the greenhouse effect, and really there's three pretty simple things that you need to understand if you want to get your head around the science. One is that greenhouse gases trap heat. We've known that from physics since the 1800s. It's a pretty well-established principle of science. Two, we know that humans have emitted greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution. Again, learned about that in school. It's pretty basic. And three, we know that since humans have been emitting these heat-trapping greenhouse gases, the oceans, the air, and the land have all warmed. So the science is actually pretty settled. We know that NASA, the Bureau of Meteorology, the CSIRO, all these trusted institutions say that climate change is happening, it's serious, and that we have to act on it.
Piers Ackerman, you're not a scientist, but you followed this issue very closely. You've described climate change as a scam to redistribute wealth.
Absolutely.
Amongst other things. Why do you reject the sort of evidence that people like Professor Steffen look at?
Well, I reject it because I look at the reports about the modelling that for people like Professor Steffen are so proud of. And what I have seen time and time again from the ClimateGate emails from East Anglia and people intimately involved at the top of forming the IPCC's policies is a continuing saga of fraud, data manipulation, and wild statements from Professor Steffen's own chair, people like Tim Flannery, who are trying to scare people with preposterous predictions
about sea level rising.
About sea level rising. In fact, Tanya Plibersek, David Bradbury's colleague, tells us that the central coast of New South Wales is going to be submerged. Now, I've actually been out in the Pacific to Kiribati to ask the natives there whether, because Kiribati is always cited as the place that is going to sink. And I asked the people there, and I must say that they said there is no evidence here that the sea levels are rising, and a number of them had come from other islands to Kiribati, or Christmas Island, as the big island there, to live because there was more economic opportunity there. And they said if this island was going to be submerged by rising sea levels, we would not have brought our families here.
Have there been, Professor Steffen, some overstated claims?
Well, I can't speak for all sorts of claims out there. What I do want to do, though, is get right back to the science. And it certainly does not rest on models. I never mentioned models once.
Well, you did actually talk about the modelling.
Can I finish? Can you let me finish?
Yeah.
No, I talked about the basic physics of the system, observations, and process understanding. That's the foundations of science. That's what we test each other in the peer-reviewed literature. Then the models, we test those too, built on that physics understanding and tested against the observations. Now, to be frank, they do very well on some things. They don't do so well on other things. And that's where part of the uncertainty comes in. But that's part of the scientific process. Oh. But the fact that the models, for example, can't simulate very well how rainfall is changing in Australia doesn't mean that the planet isn't warming, and it doesn't mean that human emissions of greenhouse gases are the primary cause. That rests on fundamental physics.
But you see, the rainfall prediction was one of the drivers for the desalination, very expensive desalination plants that a number of Australian states have installed. And this is the sort of the scaremongering that's taken place on the back of this pseudoscience that's come out of things like the Australian Science Commission. And I'd point out that the University of Melbourne just last week had to withdraw a report from two of its scientists scientists who were talking about a hockey stick, a southern hemisphere hockey stick, when it was found that their modelling was false.
Well, let's bring in our politicians now. Adam Band, I can see you shaking your head. They're Deputy Greens leader. Why are you so certain on this? Should politicians be a little more sceptical?
Well, I think this is grassy knoll stuff to suggest that there's some international conspiracy, that a political conspiracy to stop the world, to force the world's leading scientists, and an overwhelming majority of them, to come to one conclusion, misunderstands science, and is one of the most absurd theories I've heard. And when you look at other governments and political parties around the world, you find in Europe that they don't treat climate change as a political issue. You have conservative political leaders getting up saying, we need to act on this and we need to act on it soon. It's only in places like Australia where the debate has become so highly politicised that you get these absurd theories that somehow politicians are there, or political pressure is being brought to bear on scientists. And I think one of the big mistakes that Conservatives in this country have made is to align themselves with kooky denialists, and I think the tide of history and the tide of science is going to wash right over them.
Piers, I'd better let you respond to that.
I'm not sure
you're being classified as a kooky denialist, but it's true that Conservative leaders like David Cameron in the UK certainly accept this
David,
science.
as you said in your introduction, the tide is actually washing back the other way. I think the world was prepared to believe that there may be some climate change, but now I think that by and large around the world, in Western nations, we are seeing people take a closer look at the statements being made by Green leaders and so forth. And I don't have to call Adam kooky or anything like that. But we are seeing a tide roll back. As you say, the majority of Australians are not as wedded to the notion of global warming as
I don't think they're as wedded to the notion of putting a price on carbon. Whether they've shifted their view on global warming or not, I don't know. Greg Hunt, as the Shadow Climate Change Minister, you're often reminded that you wrote a thesis called a tax to make polluters pay. You do believe in climate change, don't you? You haven't shifted your view on this.
Absolutely I do. My view is that the issue is real and it's significant and it's important. However, what I disagree with is this idea of demonising the at least one-third of Australians who come to a different conclusion. Australia's probably divided pretty much consistently over a long period of time. Two-thirds of the population are of the view that, to differing degrees, the science is real. One-third, which is in terms of the adult population, about 5 million, have a different view. And to denounce one-third as kooky denialists or other things...
How do you characterise them?
People who don't believe the theories.
But you're saying they're wrong.
I come to a different conclusion, but I
they're wrong,
think...
is what you're saying.
Let me say this. I think it is very, very boastful of anybody to stand there and say, we know that these other groups of people, who include very eminent scientists, should be denounced. And there are those who are strong advocates for the science that have made some claims which equally haven't turned out to be true, such as Sydney's dams would be empty, whereas they're anything but. So, yes, I believe in the science. And let me take you on for a minute just to clarify the thesis which is often raised. I'm very proud of it. A 20-year-old thesis stands up today. It was on trade waste, and it was precisely because of that work on economic instruments that my judgment is that using electricity to try to change our behaviours by driving up the price is the worst possible, least effective thing you could do.
We'll get into that, how to deal with this problem.
Correct you.
OK, David Bradbury, the Assistant Treasurer. How have you approached this question of the science in your own mind?
Well, I'm clearly not a scientist, but one of the things that has been very persuasive as far as I'm concerned has been that the overwhelming weight of peer-reviewed scientific opinion on this. And I think that as a government, we have an obligation to try and mitigate against any risks. Now, when you have the sort of advice that's been coming forward to our government, to previous governments, and indeed governments all around the world, if you have a look at Copenhagen, for all of the debate and the disagreement that occurred, I actually don't recall there being a lot of disagreement about this question of the science and the need to do something. Right. The debate was around the extent to which we might respond. I have to say I'm a fairly pragmatic person. I also look at this and say fossil fuels, they're not going to be there forever, and there is something to be said for trying to prepare our economy for a future where we are less dependent upon those fossil fuels. I think that's a sensible economic decision for us to be taking. So when you put all of these things together, I think there's a very powerful case for acting.
Tim Wilson, the Director of Climate Change Policy at the Institute of Public Affairs, do you think we have moved beyond this question of the science? Do you have questions in your own mind still?
Well, I think I sit between most of the comments that people have already outlined. I mean, we've heard about uncertainties. There are uncertainties, but there are things that I agree with. Once you get past the basic propositions of the physics of climate change, you enter into uncertainty around future projections and, therefore, what the policy response should be. And that's where my interest is. We haven't...
So to be clear, though, you're saying, yes, climate change is happening, but you're not convinced it's as bad as some projections have indicated.
Putting in a snapshot, that's basically the case. But when you get to the policy response, what we have is a ridiculously large policy response.
We'll get to the policy response. We're just trying to establish, and John Hewson, the former Liberal leader and economist, when you look at this issue, you've taken, a fairly pragmatic view as well. And as a Conservative, coming from the Conservative side of politics, how does that fit into your ideology?
Well, I'm pretty much, on the same page as David, and that is that, we wouldn't know that this was a problem, except that a significant percentage of scientific opinion, in fact, 90-odd% of peer-assessed scientists agree that it's a significant problem, that it's an urgent problem, and that's good enough for me. We can't look out the window and see it. We have to take that. And that's unusual because scientists usually contest each other. They question each other. They question each other's theories. They question each other's research results. Yet here, a substantial body of opinion has essentially come together to say the same thing. And that's good enough.
There are still some doubts out there.
Look, you'll always have debate at the fringes. But when a clear majority have raised the issue and now obviously are prepared to support the issue, I think you've just got to accept it on face value.
And David Eyre, the General Manager of Research and Development at New South Wales Farmers Association. Farmers, of course, have an intimate connection with the land that they live and work on. What sort of views do you pick up about the actual science of this? Is it have farmers made up their mind on this?
I think farmers are pretty much like the rest of the Australian population, divided much in the way that Greg said. No, we have our climate champions, we have our climate deniers, and most are in the middle. But what I have to say is that farmers know a lot about climate and a lot about meteorology. The climate is core business for them, and they study these issues very carefully. So I would agree with John Hewson. There are lots of practical reasons why in Australia we need to adapt. Farmers are very big energy users, so whatever your position is on the actual climate science, it makes sense to have some kind of a policy response.
Well, Professor Poltridge, let's just, as we conclude this discussion on the science, go back to you. There obviously is a general consensus that on the balance of scientific evidence, people are accepting climate change is happening. Are you saying that Australians should be more sceptical?
You've got to be precise about what you're going to be sceptical about. There's no question that the bald statement that if people keep putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the temperature of the world will go up higher than it would have been otherwise. There's no great scepticism about that statement. The big argument is all about whether the rise in temperature of the world will be big enough to worry about. And that's where you get an enormous amount of scepticism, both without and within the scientific community.
So you think there will be perhaps a rise in temperature, but not something we need to...
Oh, I'm absolutely certain. Well, excuse me, I'm not absolutely certain, but I'm willing to go along with the idea that put more CO2 into the atmosphere, the temperature will go up. But how much it will go up is just a question that has yet to be resolved.
Will Stefan, just finally on this issue, how much will it go up? What are we going to see in terms of sea levels, in terms of the temperature, in terms of some of these things that we're told we should worry about?
Well, the Earth, in fact, has done that experiment in the past. We were in an ice age about 20,000 years ago. And in coming out of that ice age, the average temperature of the Earth has increased about 5 degrees or so. But you can go back and back out of that information how sensitive climate is to carbon dioxide. And the answer you get from that is about 3 degrees for a doubling of carbon dioxide. So we had 280 parts per million pre-industrial. We're sitting at about 390 now. You can do the maths, about 560 is a doubling. And at present rates of emission, without effective climate policy, we're going to hit that around mid-century or second half of the century.
A 3-degree rise by the middle of this century.
It's possible without effective climate action.
Okay. Well,
now the range around that is about 2 to 4.5, but most of the evidence is around 3. In terms of sea level, you asked about that. My best estimate, reading the scientific literature, is between 0.5 metre and 1 metre on a global average by 2100. But it'll not stop there. There's an enormous amount of inertia in the ocean and in the ice systems. It'll keep going for centuries after that. During the last warm period the Earth had, about 130,000 years ago, we were about 1 degree Celsius warmer, which is what we're approaching now. Sea level was about 5 to 6 metres higher when it finally equilibrated out. So we have some, indeed, very big risks ahead, depending on how far you want to look out.
All right, well, we're going to look at what we're going to do about those risks and whether putting a price on carbon in the way the Gillard government has is the right answer. Stay with us.